On a quiet street in suburban Tokyo, a small elderly woman stands at her doorway waiting for her son to return home from work. He will arrive at precisely 6 in the evening, carrying a briefcase, bowing slightly as he steps inside, thanking her for dinner. To a passerby, nothing about this scene appears unusual. It looks like an ordinary Japanese family, bound by routine, respect, and quiet affection. What is invisible is that the man is not her son, and the woman is not his mother. They are both actors, hired by strangers who needed a family for a few hours. Japan's rental family industry is one of the most unusual social systems ever to emerge in a modern society. It allows people to rent fathers, mothers, siblings, spouses, children, even entire extended families by the hour. These rented relationships attend weddings, visit hospitals, console the lonely, apologize to employers, and play the role of blood relatives in moments where real family is absent, unavailable, or too painful to involve. This phenomenon could only have emerged in Japan because it grew out of a very specific contradiction. On one hand, Japanese culture places enormous value on family, lineage, appearances, and social roles. The position of father, mother, eldest son, obedient daughter carries deep expectations formed over centuries. On the other hand, modern Japan has slowly dismantled the structures that once sustained those roles. Long work hours, urban isolation, falling birth rates, rising single-person households, and generational disconnection have hollowed out the traditional family from the inside. For centuries, family in Japan was not primarily an emotional unit. It was an economic and social survival system. The IE household model organized property, inheritance, labor, and identity under a single family line. Individual desires were secondary to the continuity of the household. Parents, children, grandparents, and relatives lived under one roof, bound by duty more than affection. To be without family was to be without position. After World War II, legal reforms dismantled much of this old structure, but its expectations remained buried inside daily life. People still measured themselves by whether they fulfilled the roles of parent, spouse, child, and provider. Success was still often judged by whether one could present a stable family image to the outside world. Then the modern economy reshaped everything. Migration to cities fractured extended families. Women entered the workforce. Marriage was postponed. Birth rates collapsed. Elderly parents lived alone. Children grew up without siblings. Divorce became more common. The old family ideal survived in the imagination far longer than it survived in reality. In this gap between expectation and lived experience, an emotional vacuum formed. People were still expected to have a mother at weddings, a father at job interviews, a spouse at company events, parents to introduce to neighbors, children to confirm adulthood. When reality could not supply these figures, the pressure to maintain the appearance of a complete life did not disappear. It intensified. Out of this pressure, in the early 2000s, the first companies offering stand-in relatives quietly appeared. At first, they provided simple services: a man to pose as a boyfriend, a woman to attend a social gathering as a sister, a parent to meet concerned in-laws. Over time, demand grew more complex. Entire wedding parties were composed of hired guests. Children were hired to reassure lonely elderly people. Parents were hired to apologize on behalf of adult children who could not face their own mistakes. By the 2010s, the idea of renting a family had moved from rumor into reality. Journalists began reporting on it. Foreign media expressed disbelief. Japanese audiences responded with something closer to recognition than shock. The rental family did not feel like science fiction. It felt like a logical extension of lives already built on performance, restraint, and the careful management of appearances. In a society where emotional directness is often avoided, where burdening others is feared, where duty remains powerful long after its original structures have dissolved, the idea of renting emotional roles solved several problems at once. It allowed people to meet social expectations without forcing intimacy. It allowed loneliness to be addressed without confession. It allowed shame to be managed quietly, professionally, without exposing one's private collapse to the real family that could not provide safety anymore. Japan did not invent rental families because it lacked family values. It invented them because those values became too heavy to carry without support. And so, in thousands of apartments, hotels, hospitals, schools, and quiet neighborhood streets, People began to live with family that was present in every detail except blood. Parents who could be dismissed after dinner, children whose affection ended when the contract expired, a domestic life that looked whole from the outside, yet dissolved completely once everyone changed clothes and returned to their real, solitary rooms. This is how temporary parents became possible, not through fantasy, not through rebellion, but through quiet necessity. The roots of rental families stretch deeper than modern loneliness. They reach into a society where relationships were once fixed, inherited, and nearly impossible to escape. For centuries, Japanese identity was anchored not in the individual, but in the household. To exist meant to belong to a family line. One's name, work, marriage, and even death were understood as extensions of an unbroken chain. There was no space for emotional choice, only position. In the old IE system, family was not primarily about affection. It was about continuity. Sons inherited the household, daughters married out, elders ruled, younger members obeyed. Love could exist, but it was secondary to duty. A child did not belong to themselves. They belonged to the family structure. This model created stability, but it also created rigid emotional silence. Personal suffering was expected to be absorbed quietly for the good of the household. After the war, legal reforms officially dismantled this structure. Individuals gained rights, women gained legal equality. Marriage became a choice rather than a transaction, yet culture rarely changes at the same speed as law. The emotional expectations of the old system survived long after the structure itself collapsed. People were now free to choose their lives, but still measured by how well they fulfilled roles that no longer had solid foundations. This contradiction defined post-war Japan, a society that told people they were free, yet judged them as if they were not. A society that no longer guaranteed lifelong family support, yet still expected everyone to present a stable family image to the world. By the 1970s and 80s, this gap quietly widened. Urbanization scattered relatives across prefectures. Corporate culture replaced the extended family as the main unit of daily life. Marriage became delayed or avoided entirely. Birth rates fell year after year. Elderly parents were left behind in shrinking rural towns or confined to small city apartments. The old family scaffolding quietly rotted beneath modern concrete. Yet the symbolic power of family never weakened. Weddings still demanded parents, career success still assumed a spouse, respectability still required children, neighbors still asked about sons and daughters, employers still evaluated stability through family status. Even when the real family disappeared, the shadow of it still judged those who stood alone. This created a uniquely Japanese tension. In many countries, the collapse of traditional family structures was accompanied by the rise of individualism. In Japan, individualism remained socially dangerous. Independence was allowed economically, but not emotionally. People could live alone, but were still expected to appear connected. It was in this space that the idea of temporary family became imaginable, not as deception, but as emotional infrastructure, a way to simulate the old roles without reviving the old burdens, a way to display belonging without surrendering one's private life to it. The first whispers of rental relatives did not begin with weddings or celebrations. They began with apologies. In the late 1990s, companies emerged offering professional apologizers. If a son could not face his employer after a mistake, a father figure would appear instead. If a husband disappeared, an uncle would come to negotiate with the in-laws. These early services framed family as a social function rather than a biological truth. Once that boundary had been crossed, the idea expanded quickly. If fatherhood could be rented for a day, why not motherhood for a week? If a sibling could apologize for you, why not celebrate with you? If a parent could represent you, why not replace the one who was gone? The industry did not evolve through fantasy. It evolved through unmet necessity. Japan did not lose its family values. It lost the physical families capable of carrying them. They spoke about neighbors, aches in the back, rising prices at the supermarket. After 2 hours, the woman stood up, put on her shoes, bowed gently, and left. The client paid her through a monthly contract. "It does not feel fake," the client said. "It feels temporary in a way real family never is." For many users of these services, the boundary between performance and emotion blurs quickly. Clients often begin with clear intentions. They need someone for a wedding. someone to meet parents, someone to sit beside a hospital bed so they are not alone. But after the role is filled once, the silence that follows feels heavier than before. Many book again and again. Rental parents visit schools for parent-teacher conferences. They write careful notes about grades, nod seriously during meetings, and scold gently after. The children know they are actors, and yet some children still wait by the door when they are scheduled to arrive. The expectation becomes real even when the relationship is defined as false. In hospitals, rented relatives sit quietly beside patients with no visitors. They hold hands, they listen, they answer nurses' questions. They leave before death when the contract ends. Nurses privately admit that some patients die with only rented family in the room. In wedding halls, entire family trees are sometimes constructed from contracts. A bride whose parents disowned her for marrying outside her prefecture stands before hired parents who smile proudly as if they have known her since childhood. Guests applaud. Photographs preserve a history that never existed. The workers who perform these roles describe their own emotional tightrope. One man who had played the role of father for more than a decade said he had attended over 100 life events that were not his own. Graduations, hospitalizations, weddings, apologies. In none of them was he allowed to leave a permanent trace. "I am always someone important," he said, "but never someone remembered." Agencies train their actors carefully. They study everyday speech. They learn how to listen without imposing. They memorize backstories. They learn to cry quietly without drawing attention. Many report that the hardest part of the job is the moment after leaving, when they walk alone back to their real apartments and transition from being someone's mother or son into being no one's. Clients, too, experience the emotional cost. A man who rented a weekly daughter to keep him company in retirement admitted he dreaded the end of the contract more than his real daughter's departure years earlier. "With my real child," he said, "I had guilt. With the rented one, I have emptiness." The daily customs that surround rental families are built on courtesy and controlled distance. There's always a clear start time and end time. There's always payment. There's always a moment when the illusion dissolves. The need for a family that cannot be demanded from reality. Rental families survive not because people misunderstand their artificial nature. They survive because people understand it completely and still choose it, not for illusion, but for adjacency to something real enough to soothe what absence left behind. Behind the quiet routines of rental families lie the stories that push people toward them in the first place. These stories rarely begin with curiosity. They begin with rupture, divorce, death, estrangement, migration, shame, silence that becomes too heavy to sit with alone. A man in his early 40s from Chiba rented a father for 3 years. His real father had died suddenly when he was a teenager. The grief was never discussed in his home. His mother avoided the topic. Relatives changed the subject. When he married, he stood at the altar without a parent beside him. The wedding photographs showed only the couple. Years later, when his first child was born, the same emptiness returned. "I wanted my child to see a grandfather," he said. The man he hired visited twice a month. He read picture books aloud, corrected the way chopsticks were held, complained mildly about the cold. "My son believes he is my father," the client said. "I do not know what that makes me." For others, the use of rental family is driven not by loss, but by fear of exposure. A woman from Osaka who had cut ties with her biological parents due to years of emotional abuse hired stand-ins for a company awards ceremony. Her employer expected parents to attend. Explaining the truth felt impossible. The rented parents applauded politely from the audience. Photographs were taken. Her career proceeded without disruption. "It protected me," she said, "and it imprisoned me at the same time." There are also cases shaped by social stigma that refuses to fade. One young man hired a mother and sister to attend his fiancée's family meeting because his own family had been involved in a scandal years earlier. He feared that even mentioning it would poison the marriage. The meeting went smoothly. The marriage followed. The truth remained sealed inside him. "I did it so my future could be clean," he said, "but my past is now buried under layers of performance." Not all users seek long-term arrangements. Some request one-day families for moments charged with unbearable symbolism. Graduation ceremonies, funerals, hospital visits. One nurse in a Tokyo oncology ward recalled how a woman's rented son arrived every afternoon, and held her hand until visiting hours ended. After her death, the man bowed to the staff, thanked them, and never returned. The nurse later learned that the woman had no living relatives. "At least someone called her mom at the end," the nurse said. "The reasons are different. The emotional gravity is the same. Each story circles the same absence, a missing anchor, a gap left by family expectations that outlived actual families. Agencies carefully manage boundaries to prevent emotional collapse on both sides. Contracts often forbid exclusivity. Workers are discouraged from developing dependent relationships. Clients are reminded that everything is temporary, and yet dependence still forms. It forms quietly, politely, against regulation. One rental mother admitted she had once broken down after a teenage client stopped booking sessions without explanation. She had watched the boy for a year, cooked his favorite meals, checked his homework, celebrated his birthday. "I knew it was business," she said, "but my body forgot." On the client side, some experience a delayed grief after contracts end. A woman who had rented a husband for neighborhood events for nearly 5 years described how she felt when the man retired from the agency. "I did not lose a spouse," she said, "but I lost the shape of a life." What makes these stories especially charged in Japan is the country's long relationship with role performance. Social life has always involved masks, politeness, duty, obligation. The rental family simply makes the mask explicit. It turns what was once implicit into contract. There are moments when this system collides painfully with reality. Some clients confess to rented relatives. They blur the boundary intentionally. They ask for advice meant for real parents. They cry without concern for the clock. They call outside scheduled hours. Agencies intervene. Contracts are edited. Distance is restored. The tragedy, if it can be called that, is not that rental families are fake. The tragedy is that many of the emotions involved are not. In these homes, lunches are cooked that will never become tradition. Advice is given that carries no inheritance. Scoldings are performed without shared history. Love is simulated without shared blood. And yet the need it touches is entirely real. Japan's rental families exist at the exact intersection where emotional absence meets cultural expectation. They do not replace family. They replace the unbearable visibility of having none. And for now, that is enough for thousands of people to keep paying for a parent who leaves at the end of the evening. By the early 2010s, rental family services had moved beyond personal tragedy and entered public awareness through real events that briefly pierced Japan's carefully maintained emotional privacy. In 2014, a Tokyo-based agency became the subject of nationwide debate after journalists uncovered that multiple high-profile wedding ceremonies had been staged almost entirely with rented relatives. In one case, over 2/3 of the guests were contracted actors. The bride and groom had met online, both estranged from their biological families. The wedding appeared flawless. Only months later did a leaked internal schedule reveal the orchestration. The media response was mixed. Some called it deception, others called it mercy. Around the same time, schools in Kanagawa Prefecture quietly introduced guidelines for handling rented parents at official events. Teachers had become aware that some adults attending conferences were not legal guardians. The schools chose not to expose the practice. Instead, they adjusted paperwork and continued normally. The priority, administrators said, was protecting the child's emotional stability, not biological accuracy. A widely circulated magazine article in 2017 followed the life of a rented sibling over 6 months. The worker played the role of an older sister to a teenage girl whose real family refused contact after she dropped out of school. The rented sister attended counseling sessions with her, accompanied her to job interviews, and texted her every morning before work. The girl eventually returned to education. When the contract ended, the two never spoke again. The feature ended with a single line from the girl. "She was my sister when I needed one." Comparisons with other countries often fail to capture the specificity of the Japanese case. In Western nations, paid companionship usually fills social or romantic gaps. In Japan, it fills structural roles that define legitimacy. A friend is optional, a parent is proof, a spouse is status, a child is continuity. Rental families serve not the heart alone, but the architecture of social recognition itself. In South Korea, similar services emerged but remain niche and short-lived. In Europe, legal and ethical concerns stalled development. Only in Japan did the practice embed itself deeply enough to become normalized in certain urban districts. The difference lies in how visibly one's social legitimacy is tied to family representation. Another notable case involved a municipal office employee in Saitama who hired a fake family for decades-long neighborhood participation. For over 40 years, his neighbors believed his wife and child lived in another prefecture and visited occasionally. In truth, every appearance was rented. When the man died alone in his apartment, police contacted the agency listed in his phone. 2 actors attended his funeral. No biological relatives ever appeared. The neighbors expressed shock not at the deception itself, but at how convincingly the illusion had endured. There are also cases where rental families entered legal gray zones. A woman in her 70s hired a son for over 10 years without her biological children knowing. When she passed away, the rented son attempted to fulfill burial arrangements out of emotional obligation. The biological heirs intervened, leading to a courtroom battle that exposed the entire arrangement. The judge ruled strictly by blood. The rented son left the courthouse silently and was never seen again. What emerges across all these cases is a pattern of social smoothing. Rental families prevent conflict, conceal fractures, and allow life rituals to proceed without confrontation. They preserve appearances without forcing reconciliation. They allow people to move forward without reopening wounds buried under decades of silence. Yet these same qualities create unease. Every successful illusion delays emotional truth. Every perfect photograph conceals a history that remains unresolved. The system works precisely because it avoids correction. It covers absence rather than repairing it. By the late 2010s, the industry stabilized into a quiet equilibrium. No mass protests, no dramatic bans, no sweeping political reform. It existed in the narrow space between private choice and public politeness. Known, rarely discussed, widely misunderstood. Journalists attempting to investigate deeper often encountered closed doors. Agencies declined interviews, workers used aliases, clients refused to be filmed. What the outside world perceived as a curiosity was, for participants, a deeply managed survival mechanism. Rental families were no longer an emotional anomaly. They had become a functional component of social maintenance. And yet, beneath the surface efficiency, pressures were beginning to build that would eventually challenge whether this quiet replacement of family could continue at all. By the turn of the 2020s, the forces that had once allowed rental families to quietly thrive began to shift in ways that the industry had not anticipated. The same social changes that created the demand for substitute families were now weakening the very structure that made such substitutions meaningful. The rituals still existed, but their authority was thinning. The audience that once required parents at ceremonies was aging out. Younger generations were no longer bound to the same unspoken scripts. Marriage itself began to lose its compulsory status. A growing number of people openly rejected weddings entirely. Others chose small legal registrations without family presence. The symbolic pressure that once made rented parents necessary started to loosen. Without the need to perform social completeness, the need to rent it also declined. Economic strain intensified the pressure. Long-term rental family arrangements were expensive. Monthly subscriptions for a single parent figure could equal a significant portion of a working person's income. As wages stagnated and living costs rose, fewer people could maintain long-term emotional contracts. What had once been justified as emotional survival increasingly became a luxury. At the same time, Japan's aging crisis accelerated. More elderly people required genuine caregiving rather than symbolic presence. The difference between a worker who could pretend to be a son and a caregiver who could lift a body became critical. Families that might once have hired weekly visits now confronted realities that rented roles could not carry. The industry was never designed for physical dependency. It was designed for appearances. Technology quietly altered emotional substitution as well. Virtual companionship, AI chat interfaces, and digital avatars began absorbing part of the loneliness that rental families once addressed. These lacked physical warmth, but they were cheaper, more predictable, and free of moral ambiguity. For some, that was enough. Younger Japanese, especially those born after the 1990s, grew up in an emotional environment radically different from their parents. The shame once attached to being single weakened. The expectation of lifelong marriage eroded. The idea that one must display family to prove adulthood slowly faded. For them, renting parents often felt unnecessary or even unsettling. Why act? A university student said in a street interview. If you are alone, you are alone. Even among rental family workers, quiet fatigue spread. Many reported emotional burnout. The repetition of intimate but temporary bonds created a peculiar erosion of identity. To be needed deeply and then erased repeatedly took a psychological toll. Few were trained to endure. Turnover increased. Veteran actors retired. New recruits were harder to find. Agencies also faced growing legal scrutiny. As rental family arrangements became longer and more emotionally involved, questions grew sharper. Could emotional harm be monetized without accountability? Who bears responsibility when a child forms attachment to someone contractually required to disappear? What happens when an elderly client wills property to a rented son? These issues had once been confined to rare courtroom cases. Now they hovered permanently at the edge of the industry. Public attitudes did not turn hostile, they turned quieter. Rental families stopped being a curiosity. They became something people no longer wanted to talk about at all. Silence once again closed over the practice. Then the pandemic arrived. For an industry built on physical presence, scheduled rituals, and controlled face-to-face intimacy, the sudden isolation was catastrophic. Weddings were canceled, hospital visits were restricted, school meetings moved online, funerals were limited. The ceremonies that justified rental family appearances vanished almost overnight. Some agencies attempted remote services, video call parents, digital siblings, online guests for celebrations viewed through screens. But the illusion collapsed quickly without physical proximity. A rented presence on a tablet carried none of the social gravity that had once made the practice function. Many agencies closed quietly during this period. No public announcements, no scandals, just empty offices and disconnected phone numbers. Workers moved on to other forms of employment. Clients returned to solitude. For some, this forced separation brought unexpected confrontation with reality. People who had relied on rented parents were suddenly left with no substitute at all. A man who had hired a weekly family for nearly 7 years found himself fully alone during lockdown. I thought I would collapse, he said later, but I learned I could breathe without them. For others, the loss cut deeply. A woman who had rented a mother figure for over a decade described the abrupt disappearance as more painful than her real mother's death. With one, I had grief, she said. With the other, I had abandonment. The pandemic did not kill rental families by judgment. It killed them by interruption. When the machinery of social ritual stopped, the replacement mechanism lost its purpose. And when life slowly resumed, many people no longer returned to the same emotional contracts they once needed to survive. When daily life resumed its surface normality, something subtle had shifted. The silence that followed the disappearance of rental families was not loud enough to be called a social change, but it was deep enough to be permanent. Many who had once depended on rented relatives did not rush to replace them. The world had paused long enough for people to glimpse what remained when the performance stopped. For some, this brought a new kind of acceptance. A man in his 50s, who had previously hired a family for New Year celebrations, admitted that the first holiday alone was unbearable. The second was still painful. By the third, it was simply quiet. I stopped pretending, he said. Not to others, to myself. The rented laughter at the table had once protected him from the weight of the empty room. Without it, the room stayed empty. But it also became truthful. For others, the absence felt like a second bereavement. A woman who had relied on a rented daughter for companionship after retiring described how the calendar itself became hostile. Birthdays arrived without ceremony. Seasonal festivals passed without witnesses. The structure that had once given her week's texture simply dissolved. She did not seek to replace it digitally. A screen telling me good morning is not a child, she said. The deeper reason rental families began to fade lies not only in economics or technology, but in generational psychology. Younger adults in Japan increasingly reject the idea that one's life must conform to a fixed narrative. The pressure to display family as proof of legitimacy is weakening, not disappearing, but losing its absolute authority. This shift is slow and uneven. In rural areas, traditional expectations still persist with force. In major cities, anonymity has softened social judgment. The further one moves from inherited community, the less necessary symbolic family roles become. Where no one is watching, performance loses urgency. At the same time, the language of mental health has expanded. What once could only be managed through substitution is now spoken through therapy. Loneliness is no longer exclusively moral failure. Estrangement is no longer unmentionable. Abuse is now named. Silence, once praised as endurance, is increasingly questioned. These changes alter the emotional equation that once sustained rental families. When people were expected to endure without expression, temporary substitutes became bearable. When people are encouraged to confront directly, the logic of symbolic replacement weakens. There's also a quiet ethical discomfort emerging among younger generations. While older clients often framed rental families as a practical tool, younger observers are more likely to describe them as emotionally risky. They ask what happens when affection becomes a fee-based obligation. They ask what it means to teach a child that connection arrives by contract and departs on schedule. Even some former clients now frame their experiences in more complicated terms. A man who had once hired a wife role for social events described his relief when the agency closed. "I no longer had to explain myself to a stranger pretending to be my partner," he said, "but I also lost the only person who had ever sat beside me at a wedding." Perhaps most telling is how little public effort has appeared to preserve the practice. There are no cultural foundations defending rental families as tradition, no museums documenting their role, no movements demanding their continuation. They entered society as necessity. They leave it without ceremony. What once operated as hidden infrastructure now lingers as rumor and anecdote. A few agencies still exist. A handful of contracts continue quietly. But the idea that rental families could serve as a stable emotional system no longer holds the same certainty. The emotional conditions that created them have not vanished. Loneliness remains. Estrangement remains. Unspoken pain remains. What is fading is not the wound, but the belief that it must be disguised. And when disguise is no longer required, the stage slowly empties. What remains now are the individuals themselves, standing where family once stood, asked to decide whether to confront the absence directly or carry it forward in another form. One final quiet question lingers over the industry's decline. If people no longer need to rent parents to appear whole, what definition of wholeness is beginning to replace it? What remains today of Japan's rental families is not a functioning system, but a residue of intention. The agencies that once managed thousands of roles now operate quietly, if at all. Their websites still exist in shadowed corners of the internet. Their phone numbers still ring, sometimes answered, sometimes not. The language has softened. Where once they offered parents and children, they now speak of companions, attendant support, emotional assistance. The family itself has dissolved back into suggestion, yet the traces linger in subtler places. In old photo albums where a smiling father appears only once and is never seen again. In wedding videos where relatives applaud with perfect timing but never return for funerals. In hospital memories where a warm hand once held another until visiting hours ended and no one ever came back the next day. These moments were real to the people who lived inside them, even if they cannot be mapped onto bloodlines or legal records. The emotional experience did not evaporate simply because the structure that enabled it collapsed. In interviews conducted years after their last contracts, former rental workers often speak with unusual neutrality. They do not describe pride. They do not describe regret. They describe distance. Many say they no longer know how many children they once had, how many parents they once were, how many lives they entered briefly and left without trace. The roles blur together, becoming a single long silhouette of borrowed identity. Former clients, however, remember details that are not written anywhere. The way a rented mother tucked hair behind an ear, the way a rented father tied a tie too tightly, the way a rented sibling laughed a second too late at jokes they were still learning. These small imperfections were what made the performance believable and what now survive long after the contract expired. There's no monument to rental families, no public memory, no national conversation about what they represented. And yet they reveal something essential about the era that created them. They emerged in a society where family remained sacred, even as actual families disappeared. They existed in a world where loneliness was widespread, but confession was dangerous. They thrived where connection was required publicly, but could not always be sustained privately. They were not a rejection of family. They were a confession that the need for family had not faded, even when the families themselves had. What their quiet disappearance now suggests is not resolution, but transformation. The pressure to display completeness is easing. The expectation that everyone must follow the same life pattern is loosening. Pain that was once covered with substitution is now slowly being named. Yet this shift is not simple. For those who lived through both eras, something fragile was lost along with the illusion. Not the deception itself, but the protection it provided. The protection from direct confrontation with solitude. The protection from explaining one's life to a society that still quietly asks. Japan remains a country where many still eat alone, where many still die alone, where many still carry private histories of rupture and absence. The difference now is that fewer feel compelled to disguise it with borrowed faces. The rental family was never meant to last forever. It was a bridge over a period of emotional contradiction, a place where duty outlived structure, where appearance outlived belonging, where the role survived even when the person could not. Its disappearance does not mean the need vanished. It means the language of that need is changing, and perhaps that is the most Japanese ending of all. Not a confrontation, not a declaration, but a quiet withdrawal. The rented parents return their identities. The hired children give back their surnames. The borrowed family dissolves into the background of lived experience, leaving behind a question that still has no single answer. When family can no longer be inherited, displayed, or replaced by contract, what must it become instead? And is Japan finally ready to discover that without disguise?